The faded scrubs hung 2 sizes too large, a woman who'd volunteered for every double shift nobody else wanted, the kind of nurse who arrived early and left late and never once asked for gratitude. That was how Dr. Ashford first saw her, Katie Morrison, on the night rotation at Oak Creek Memorial VA Hospital in Raleigh, moving through the ward with movements that didn't quite match the timid way she held her shoulders. He didn't see what her hands could do. He didn't see the surgical precision in how she assessed a patient's airway, the way her fingers found veins in one smooth pass without hesitation. He didn't see the way older veterans watched her work, their eyes tracking her like they recognized something she was hiding. He didn't see the jacket in her locker, folded twice, the kind of old canvas that gets softer after 2 decades. He didn't see what was sewn inside the lining. None of it mattered yet. Not until the admission arrived. Katie moved through Oak Creek Memorial's ICU corridor at 11:19 p.m., the fluorescent lights humming their institutional dirge overhead, the smell of antiseptic and institutional coffee hanging thick enough to taste. She'd worked 7 consecutive nights without complaint, and the other nurses had stopped asking why she took the shifts nobody wanted. The graveyard rotation was for nurses rebuilding civilian lives, and Katie Morrison had learned to occupy the margins of a room where nobody was watching. Her scrubs were faded, a soft blue-gray from 100 washings, and she'd cinched them tight at the waist because the hospital had stopped ordering her size 8 years ago. 8 years since she'd signed the hiring paperwork. 8 years of moving through these corridors like someone who'd learned to make herself small. The scars on her left shoulder, pale and mapped like a country nobody asked about, were hidden beneath the loose fabric. That was the point. Her hands didn't tremble during codes. The other nurses had noticed it early on, Katie moving through cardiac arrests with a kind of muscle memory that felt wrong for civilian work, calling out compressions before the resident could, her movements precise as a metronome while everyone else was still processing the monitor alarm. They'd stopped questioning it. She was reliable. She was quiet. She was there. She'd hold your assignment while you took a break down in the supply closet, and she wouldn't tell anyone. She'd cover your shift without being asked. She'd stay late to finish charting so the next nurse wouldn't inherit your mistakes. In return, they left her alone. During her breaks, Katie would sit in the staff room and touch the jacket she kept in her locker, not wearing it, just touching it sometimes, her fingers tracing the outline of something sewn inside the lining. The patch was faded now, the thread coming loose at one corner. She never took it out. She just needed to know it was there. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her head like insects trapped in glass, and she'd drink her coffee black and read the same 3 pages of a novel she never finished because she always lost her place. After her break, she'd fold the jacket again and move back into the ward, and nobody would have known she'd been gone. Dr. Ashford arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, carrying a leather portfolio and the kind of expensive watch that caught light at every angle. He was the new administration director, sent from D.C. to streamline the VA's operations, which meant restructuring budgets and cutting staff and implementing pharmaceutical partnerships that promised efficiency through trial medication programs. He was 54, with silver threading through his hair like it had been carefully applied, and he wore his authority the way other men wore cologne, visible from 6 feet away. The hospital administrator introduced him during morning rounds, and Dr. Ashford moved through the ICU with the clinical detachment of someone cataloging inventory. He stopped at Katie's station when she was documenting a patient's vitals, her hands moving through the electronic chart with practice speed. The other nurses straightened slightly, but Katie kept working, her eyes on the monitor while she typed with her right hand and held a fresh cup of coffee with her left. Dr. Ashford observed her for exactly 13 seconds before speaking. "How long have you been nursing?" His voice was warm, the kind of warmth that doesn't involve heat. Katie finished her sentence in the chart, then turned to face him. 8 years. Prior experience? Yes. He waited, expecting more. She didn't provide it. Her composure was complete, not hostile, not evasive, just absent. Like speaking was a task she needed to accomplish and then return to more important work. What kind of prior experience? Katie's eyes were steady on his. Military medical training. Before the discharge. She said it like she was reading from a checklist, facts without color, information without invitation. Which branch? Army. True enough. The details weren't his to have. Dr. Ashford smiled like he'd found what he was looking for, a weakness, a woman rebuilding herself from something, a nurse who volunteered for nobody's preferred shifts and asked for nothing and would be grateful for whatever institutional structure he constructed around her. Well, we're very lucky to have experienced hands. He said it like he was complimenting her dog. Then he moved to the next room, and Katie returned to her chart. The admission came at 2:33 a.m. on a Thursday, the kind of middle-of-night admission that filled the ICU's critical beds. The paramedics brought him in unconscious, his vitals unstable, his medical file flagged with complications from Sanjin wounds, a Colonel Marcus Webb, Green Beret, admitted with respiratory distress secondary to a thoracic infection that had progressed into sepsis. The emergency medicine team worked him through intake, and Katie assisted without speaking, her hands moving through the tasks, for access, monitor leads, oxygen adjustment, with the kind of efficiency that comes from doing it 240 times before. She was charting at the nurse's station when she saw the file sitting on Dr. Ashford's desk in the next room. It wasn't her file to see. It shouldn't have been visible. But there it was, the paper jacket showing Colonel Webb's information with pharmaceutical company logos stamped across the header, experimental trial designations, drug codes, study protocols with dates and dosages that didn't match any standard treatment pathway. Katie's hand paused over her keyboard for exactly 2 seconds. Then she returned to charting. But she'd seen enough to know something was wrong. She was checking Webb's vitals at 4:24 a.m. when she froze in the doorway. The room was dark except for the monitor's glow, and his face was turned away from her, but the shape of him, the structure of his shoulders, something about the way his hand lay across his chest, it triggered something that lived in the deep files of her memory. Katie stepped into the room, her eyes adjusting to the darkness, and she looked at his face, and her breath stopped. 8 years old. Sanjin Valley. A firefight that had started at dawn and didn't end until the buildings around them had started coming down, brick and concrete and the sound of automatic weapons, and she'd been moving through the rubble doing what she was trained to do, finding people still alive, making them not dead for another hour until the helicopter came. She'd found him trapped under a collapsed wall, his left leg pinned, his eyes open but unfocused from shock and pain, and she'd worked his leg free using leverage and rage, her hands bleeding but not stopping, and she'd carried him out of the rubble on her back, across 200 meters of open ground where the snipers were still looking for targets, and she'd dumped him at the landing zone just as the bird touched down. That boy. The child whose weight she could still feel sometimes in her shoulders. That boy was lying in front of her as a Green Beret colonel, unconscious and medically compromised and hooked to monitors that tracked his failing lungs, and she recognized his face the way you recognize your own scar tissue. Katie stood in the doorway without moving. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Her composure was absolute. But something inside her shifted toward a focus so complete it made the rest of the hospital disappear. She stepped to his bedside, checked his oxygen saturation, 89% and trending down, and then she turned and walked back to the nurse's station with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She picked up his chart. She read every line. She looked at the medication list, the trial protocols, the experimental drug codes that didn't match anything she recognized. Then she made a decision, quiet and complete, standing in the fluorescent light of the ICU at 4:52 a.m., understanding that something was very wrong and that she was the only person in this hospital who could see it. The other nurses were charting in the break room. Dr. Ashford was home in his expensive house. Colonel Webb was unconscious, his oxygen dropping, his lungs failing, and Katie Morrison was standing alone with the knowledge that somebody had brought him here to use, not to heal. She touched her scrub pocket, where she kept the challenge coin from her unit, a small copper circle engraved with names of the dead. Then she moved back into Webb's room to sit with him through the rest of the night, watching his vitals like they were her job, which they had always been, even when nobody knew what she'd been trained to do. Dr. Ashford found her outside Webb's room at 6:44 a.m., before the morning shift officially began. Katie had been standing in the doorway for perhaps too long, watching the rise and fall of the colonel's chest, listening to the ventilator's mechanical rhythm, her fingers brushing the challenge coin in her scrub pocket. She didn't flinch when she heard his voice behind her. "Nurse Morrison." Not a greeting. A correction. "I'd like to know why my confidential files are being reviewed by someone with your limited credentials." She turned slowly. Dr. Ashford stood in his white coat like it was armor, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass, his eyes the color of ice water. His hands held the pharmaceutical trial documents, the ones with logos she'd recognized, trial codes she'd cross-referenced in the 3 hours she'd sat in her car after her shift, engine running, staring at numbers that didn't make sense. "The file was on your desk, Doctor." Her voice came out measured. Calm. The voice of someone trained to operate in crisis. "I was restocking supplies." "At 6:44 a.m.? On a unit you don't work." He stepped closer, his presence making the hallway air feel thin. "Colonel Webb's family is already here. His sister arrived at dawn. His mother hasn't left his bedside. I think they deserve an explanation for why a night nurse with no ICU certification is conducting independent medical reviews." Katie didn't answer. Silence was a weapon too. He walked toward Webb's room, expecting her to follow. She did. The colonel's sister, Elena, sat in a vinyl chair beside the bed, her face creased with the particular exhaustion that came from watching someone you loved fight for breath. Their mother, seated closer to Marcus, gripped his hand like it was a rope thrown into dark water. "Mrs. Webb, Elena, may I introduce Nurse Morrison?" Ashford's voice shifted into the warm register he used with families. The Predator's smile. "She was just reviewing Colonel Webb's confidential files. Perhaps you could tell them what exactly you were looking for, Katie? Is it standard procedure in your civilian training to memorize patient charts from memory?" The words landed like shrapnel. Limited civilian training. The implication hung in the air like humidity before a storm. She was unqualified, unstable, potentially dangerous near their son. "I was checking his vitals every 2 hours." Katie's jaw tightened, just a micro-movement, invisible to anyone not trained to read it. "Standard protocol for post-operative monitoring." "Which isn't your protocol, since you work nights and Colonel Webb works days, and you seem to have extended your shift significantly." Ashford turned to the family. "We'll be conducting a full review of her access logs. Rest assured, we take patient privacy extremely seriously." Elena's eyes narrowed. Katie watched the sister's protective instinct activate, the way her shoulders shifted toward her brother's bed, the way her hand found his arm. Katie had created that distrust. Not through what she'd done. Through what Ashford had made her appear to be doing. She took one measured breath. Said nothing. Left the room with her hand steady as surgical lasers. By 1:15 p.m., the break room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of a space no one wanted to occupy. Katie sat at the small table with her sandwich, turkey and mustard on wheat, nothing that required talking, and opened her lunch container. Across from her, Jessica from the med-surg unit was heating something that steamed of chemicals and microwaved dairy. To her left, a newer nurse named Connor scrolled through his phone. Katie took a bite. Jessica's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, stood immediately. "I'm supposed to help with the discharge paperwork on 412. I totally forgot." It wasn't a question. She didn't ask if anyone needed anything from her. She simply left, her chair scraping against the tile floor like nails on concrete. The sound made Connor look up. He stared at Katie for exactly 2 seconds, not hostile, just blank, then stood as well. "I have to check on my patients." He didn't have a shift for 2 more hours. Katie continued eating. Alone in the break room, the fluorescent lights hummed their electric song overhead, and she could hear the distant ping of the medication dispensary in the hallway beyond, the ventilators breathing for patients who couldn't breathe for themselves, the entire machinery of Oak Creek Memorial operating around a woman sitting at a lunch table with half a sandwich and no one to eat with. The isolation was precise. Clinical. By the time she left the break room, every nurse on the unit would know that sitting with Katie Morrison meant something was wrong with you. Friday morning, the notice appeared on the unit board at 7:48 a.m. Printed on bright yellow paper, sealed in clear plastic, positioned directly beside the staff schedule where everyone checked in before their shift. Katie saw it the same moment Nurse Peterson did. Peterson read it, glanced at Katie with something that looked like sympathy, and looked away. The heading was official. Typed. Formal. Incident report, boundary violations. Staff member, Katie Morrison, RN. Date of incident, multiple instances, week of, date. Violation type, unauthorized review of confidential patient information, inappropriate interaction with patient family members during non-assigned shift hours, violation of privacy protocols. Recommendation, formal disciplinary review and credential verification required. Signed, Dr. Richard Ashford, Acting Director. Katie stood in front of that board for 45 seconds. Nurses moving past her slowed, read it, moved faster. The words were surgical in their precision. Boundary violations. Unauthorized. Inappropriate. The language that turned a nurse's competence into instability, her dedication into obsession, her training into a warning sign. The nursing director's office was on the 3rd floor, and Katie took the stairs because the elevator required making eye contact with other staff members. Her badge still worked. For now. She knocked on the frosted glass door at 2:24 p.m. Come in. Patricia Chen, the nursing director, gestured to a chair. She'd always been fair. Strict about protocols, but fair. Behind her, sitting in the second chair like he owned the furniture, was Dr. Ashford. Katie, sit down. Patricia opened a folder. Katie's personnel file. We need to discuss this incident report and some concerns that have been brought to my attention regarding your conduct on the unit. The file was on Dr. Ashford's desk. Let me finish. Patricia's voice shifted into something colder. Dr. Ashford has documented multiple instances of what appears to be unusual focus on Colonel Webb's care. Lingering outside his room, reviewing his medical files without clinical authorization, engaging his family members in ways that made them uncomfortable. Katie, I need you to help me understand what's happening here. Ashford leaned back in his chair like he'd already won. We're trying to understand if there's something about military patients that triggers certain responses. In your case, Katie. Responses that might indicate you need some additional support. Your VA disability file shows some interesting gaps in disclosure. The words were poison delivered in a medical syringe. Gaps in disclosure. Responses. The suggestion that something was wrong with her, fundamentally, not with him. One tear escaped. Just one. Katie felt it slide down her cheek, and she wiped it without breaking eye contact with Ashford. Her hand didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. When she spoke, the measured calm of someone trained in crisis returned like muscle memory. I follow the Hippocratic Oath, Doctor. I thought you did too. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then Patricia shifted uncomfortably. Ashford's smile tightened. Neither of them had an answer for that kind of integrity stated flatly, without apology. We're going to need some time to review this, Patricia said finally. Katie, I'm going to recommend you take the next few shifts off while we sort through the documentation. Katie nodded. She stood. She left the office with her hand steady and her spine straight and the weight of the challenge coin in her pocket reminding her of something Ashford would never understand. She'd survived worse than a man with a white coat and a reputation to protect. She'd survived Sanjin. She'd survived firefights. She'd survived watching children die in her hands. A broken institutional system was just logistics. The medication orders didn't match. Katie stood in the medication room at Oak Creek Memorial, her fingers tracing the digital record on the 3rd screen she'd pulled up in the last 10 minutes, and something in her chest recognized the pattern before her conscious mind could articulate why. Colonel Webb's dosing schedule wasn't just irregular, it was structured like a pharmaceutical trial protocol, not clinical treatment. Timing windows separated by intervals that matched research frameworks rather than patient recovery timelines. The opioid orders came in escalating doses on days 7 through 12 post-admission. The sedative stacked in ways that no attending physician who'd read the chart would have authorized simultaneously. She'd administered medications in field hospitals where resources demanded improvisation, where you learn to see drug interactions the way soldiers learn to read terrain. This was the same kind of intentional architecture. Someone was building something inside Webb's bloodstream. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her head, that constant electrical hum she'd learned to ignore years ago but which now felt like a timer. She had her shift logged at 06:30 to 14:30. 7 hours and 40 minutes. The break room was empty at 08 for 7. Nurses rotated out before rounds. Residents grabbed coffee in the hallway. She moved back toward the administrative corridor with the kind of casual precision that said she belonged there, shoulders relaxed, badge visible, the posture of someone running an errand rather than someone about to cross a line that had probably been drawn specifically to keep her on the other side. Dr. Ashford's office door locked at 0800. His schedule was public, morning rounds began in 12 minutes. The file room adjacent to his office wasn't locked. Hospital policy required open access for clinical documentation. She was inside for 90 seconds. The pharmaceutical trial folder sat on his desk in a red jacket labeled with logos she recognized from the companies that had tried to recruit her for classified studies at Walter Reed. Sanjin Valley Medical Response, Experimental Pharmacology Division. A name designed to sound legitimate enough that no one asked questions. The documentation inside made her hand steady in a way that meant she was about to do something irreversible. Pain is data, she thought. This is data. Unauthorized trial enrollment. Subject identification withheld from standard medical record systems. Pharmaceutical company financial disclosures showing payments to Oak Creek Memorial's new administration director, payments listed as consultation fees in amounts that started at $50,000 and climbed monthly. Webb's name appeared nowhere in the official chart. In Ashford's trial documentation, he was subject for 47. The drug name was redacted. The dosing rationale was clinical-sounding jargon wrapped around what her pattern recognition, trained in Sanjin, sharpened in medical journals, verified in her personal study notebooks, identified immediately as hepatotoxic stacking. The liver damage would accumulate silently for weeks. By then, the trial would be concluded and the data owned by the pharmaceutical company. She photographed 3 pages with her phone. The flash was off. Her hands moved like they were on autopilot, muscle memory from a life she'd buried deep enough that even she sometimes forgot how to access it. 15 seconds. 20. The footsteps in the hallway belonged to the attending physician doing pre-rounds. She was back in the hallway before the doors opened. The folder stayed on Ashford's desk exactly as she'd found it. The photographs existed only in her phone, in the encrypted file she hadn't opened since Fort Bragg. She wasn't using it. Not yet. But the data was saved. What she didn't know was what happened next in the next 48 hours would be calculated and strategically catastrophic. The State Nursing Board complaint arrived electronically at 11:03, forwarded automatically to her home email address by HR. She read it while standing in the staff bathroom, the paper towel dispenser humming like a mechanical wasp. Allegations of credential falsification. Questions about her military service verification. Concerns about PTSD manifesting as obsessive patient monitoring and boundary violations. The complaint was signed by Dr. Ashford and dated 2 weeks prior, the day after he'd caught her standing outside Webb's room. He'd filed this before the public humiliation, before the isolation, before the write-up. He'd built this thing piece by piece with the precision of someone who'd learned exactly how to dismantle a person from inside their own institutional systems. She called the VA disability case manager at 11:27. Her voice was steady, even though she was calling from an empty examination room, even though her heart was sending messages to her body that translated to panic but which she'd learned long ago to translate as target acquisition. The case manager, Ms. Chen, took the call immediately. Her voice changed when she explained why she was calling. "I need to tell you something before someone tells you something else," Katie said, keeping her words under 10, the way combat required. Dr. Ashford is threatening to file claims about my mental fitness. I'm telling you first. The silence on the line lasted 3 seconds. Then Chen's voice came back, different now, official, protected. He called me Wednesday last week. Said you were falsifying credentials, that you served as a civilian contractor, not active military. He said you were showing signs of PTSD-related paranoia. Chen paused. Katie could hear her sorting papers. I asked him for documentation. He never sent it. Here's the problem, Katie said. Not me. Colonel Webb is in an unauthorized pharmaceutical trial. Ashford enrolled him without proper documentation. The dosing sequence is intentionally stacked. I documented the pattern, but I can't report it through normal channels because Ashford has already positioned every report I make as obsessive behavior. Another pause. Longer this time. Chen's voice came back quieter. I need you to document this in writing. Email me. I need to contact the VA Office of Inspector General. Katie understood what was being asked. The email would create a record. The record would prove that Ashford had initiated this entire campaign before she'd ever tried to report anything. It would also create a paper trail showing that she'd violated medical confidentiality by accessing trial documentation that wasn't part of her assigned clinical duties. She could protect Webb and destroy her own career in one transaction. She was reaching for the email app when her phone buzzed. A message from Dr. Ashford, need to meet in my office. Now. She stared at the screen for 5 seconds. Then she walked downstairs. Ashford's office smelled like expensive aftershave and recycled air. He stood when she entered but didn't offer her a chair. The folder, her folder, sat on his desk between them. The State Nursing Board has received some concerning submissions, he said, his voice like a lawyer explaining contract terms. They're reviewing your licensure. There's a recommendation that you take voluntary leave pending investigation. Katie kept her hands visible. Standard protocol when you're in a room with someone who's already decided you're a threat. I want to speak to the administrator. The administrator is very aware of this situation, Ashford said. In fact, I've been in contact with him about your unsuitability for this institution. You've been here 2 weeks and already you're trying to undermine treatment protocols, accessing records you have no authorization to review, showing signs of obsessive interest in a patient. I'm reporting an unauthorized trial, Katie said. Her voice dropped exactly 1 octave. Subject for 47. Pharmaceutical enrollment without full disclosure. Ashford's expression didn't change, but she saw his right hand move slightly closer to the phone. That's a serious allegation. Do you have documentation? I do. She didn't blink. And I've reported it to the VA Office of Inspector General. She hadn't. Not yet. But she would, and he needed to know that the moment for containment had passed. His face remained composed but his breathing changed, faster, shallower, the kind of panic someone experiences when they realize their timeline just accelerated beyond their control. He sat down. She remained standing. You're on administrative leave effective immediately, he said quietly. Pending investigation by hospital administration and the state licensing board. Your badge access will be revoked. You'll surrender your credentials today. Katie turned to leave. Major, he said. She stopped. He'd never used her rank before. She'd never told him her rank. She turned back slowly. How did you? Your personnel file has been reviewed by every agency that matters, he said, and she heard in his voice the exact moment he understood he'd already lost. Your background check shows 2 tours of active duty. Special operations medical training. And yes, your rank. Which makes this accusation particularly serious, because it shows you knew the chain of reporting and chose to go around it anyway. Katie turned back toward the door. She had her hand on the frame when she heard him stand up, heard the quality of his breathing change from controlled to something sharper. She could have turned around. She could have engaged. Instead she walked out, down the hallway, past the nursing station where 3 nurses pretended not to watch her go, and into the employee locker room where her shift jacket hung next to Webb's medical file, the one she'd found in the administrative logs, the one showing his real diagnosis, the one proving he'd never needed this trial at all. She changed out of her scrubs in 9 minutes. Folded them. Placed them in her personal bag. The unit patch from her old jacket, the one from Sanjin, sewn inside the lining 20 years ago, was still there. Still intact. She'd kept that jacket through every assignment since, through medical discharge, through civilian work, through becoming someone small enough that institutions could stop seeing her entirely. She put the jacket on, closed her locker, and walked back upstairs to turn in her badge. Webb was asleep in his room when she passed. The monitors showed normal vitals. For now. Ashford wouldn't move against him until the administrative investigation had concluded, another week, maybe 2. Katie had that long to burn everything. She had to build a wall around a man she'd saved once in Sanjin and might be about to have to save again in a hospital 3,000 miles away. She turned in her badge at 14:47. The ventilator's rhythmic wheeze filled Webb's room like the steady breathing of something wounded and waiting. Katie checked the 4 line at 2,247 hours, 17 minutes after she'd turned in her badge, and felt the first tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. The bag of experimental medication hung on the pole exactly as Ashford had ordered it, and the numbers on the monitor told her everything she needed to know. Respiratory rate dropping. Oxygen saturation holding steady only because of the supplemental flow, not because Webb's lungs were doing the work. She'd seen this presentation before. 20 years ago in Sanjin, watching soldiers emerge from the fog of opioids into something worse, the blank stare of a man whose body had forgotten how to breathe. By 02:47 hours, Webb's lips had taken on a faint bluish tint at the edges. Not dramatic. Not the kind of thing most nurses would catch at a glance. But Katie wasn't most nurses, and she watched the color deepen by another shade every 20 minutes, each subtle shift a countdown she couldn't interrupt. The experimental drug protocol in his system, the one she'd documented, the one she'd tried to report, the one that should have landed Ashford in front of a licensing board, had been calibrated without accounting for the opioid baseline already in his system. No one else had seen it. No one else had been trained in field medicine where you learn to read the body's whispers before they became screams. The monitors beeped in steady rhythm. Everything looked normal to the night shift residents checking vitals every 2 hours. Everything looked like a man sleeping in a hospital bed. Everything looked like a lie. At 03:01 hours, Webb stopped breathing. Not the kind of pause that resolves on its own. Not the kind of breath hold that stretches and then releases. The kind where the body simply gives up, where the signals from brain to lungs take a wrong turn somewhere in the chemistry Ashford had introduced, and the silence that follows is absolute. Katie was at the door 30 seconds into the arrest. She'd been sitting in the break room 3 halls away, and something in her had known. 20 years of combat medicine doesn't leave you. It lives in your nervous system like a second heartbeat, waiting for the signal. His lips had gone from blue to purple. His eyes were open, unseeing, the whites beginning to roll back. The monitor had erupted into the flat line that erases everything else, one long scream of sound that brought the night shift residents running like they'd been yanked on invisible strings. Respiratory arrest, get a crash cart. One of the residents, a man named Torres, was already reaching for the code blue button. The other, a woman named Reeves, stood frozen with her hands halfway between Webb's chest and the supply cart, the uncertainty of inexperience making her motion stutter. Dr. Ashford came through the door still buttoning his white coat, his face flushed from having been asleep. He'd kept quarters on the 3rd floor, the better to monitor his trial subjects without the inconvenience of actually being present for emergencies. Prep 2 milligrams epi, for push, he barked, his voice taking on the clinical snap that made residents move without thinking. Get me a 12 lead, now. Katie shoved past Torres. The movement wasn't violent. She didn't throw an elbow or knock him sideways. She simply moved through the space where he occupied it with the fluid precision of someone who had done this in the dark, in the rain, in the middle of a firefight, with rounds snapping overhead and the specific knowledge that the next 90 seconds determined whether a man lived or died. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory from 20 years and 10,000 practice drills overriding her civilian credentials and her fired status and the fact that she was no longer technically allowed to touch a patient. "Don't give him epi," she said flatly. "That combination will kill him." Ashford's face went white, then crimson. "Security. This nurse is relieved of." Katie blocked his access to the forecourt with her body, her shoulders between him and the line he was about to use as a weapon. The medical student called for backup, but Katie's voice cut across the chaos with the kind of authority that stops people mid-motion. He's in respiratory depression from opioid and drug interaction, not cardiac arrest. Epi will trigger tachycardia and combined with the experimental compound creates cardiac arrest. You kill him. Each word came out flat and certain, the voice of someone who had made this calculation under worse conditions than a well-lit hospital room. She turned to Reeves, who was staring at her with eyes wide enough to swallow a fist. "I need a bag valve mask, now. And get me a 14-gauge needle and whatever you have for chest seals, tape, plastic, anything." "Who the hell are you?" Ashford started. "Someone who knows what happens when you combine that drug with synthetic opioids," Katie said. She was already positioning the bag valve mask over Webb's face, her palm fitting the silicone with the kind of perfect pressure that comes from repetition you can't fake. "Breathe. Watch the chest rise. Breathe again." The room around her had gone quiet except for the monitors and her own measured voice. "Torres, I need you to get me for access in both arms, 16-gauge minimum. Reeves, find me dextrose and keep it running hot. We're going to need glucose for the opioid component." The residents moved because they didn't know what else to do, because her voice sounded like someone's mother and someone's drill sergeant combined into one person who clearly had done this before. Ashford backed toward the door, his phone already in his hand, his face the color of old meat. "Security is on the way. You're done here." Katie didn't look at him. Her eyes were on Webb's chest, watching it rise and fall with the rhythm she was creating, watching the monitor where the flat line was starting to register small peaks again as she hyperventilated him with controlled precision, not panic, not hope, just the mathematics of keeping a human body alive while the pharmaceutical interactions untangled themselves. His lips went from purple to blue. From blue back toward pink. The monitors started beeping again, not with the scream of arrest, but with the steady pulse of a heart finding its rhythm again. "Oxygen saturation climbing," Torres reported, his voice shaking. 92%. 94%. 96%. Katie continued the bag valve mask, her hand steady as surgical steel, her breathing matched to Webb's as if they were two halves of the same system. 20 years ago she'd done this in a Sanjin compound with a child whose name she'd never learned, whose face she'd carried in her muscle memory ever since. 20 years later she was doing it again in a hospital in Raleigh, for a man who'd been that child, for a man who'd come back as a Green Beret colonel and fallen into the hands of someone who saw him as a data point in a pharmaceutical trial. "Get respiratory therapy up here now," Ashford snapped into his phone from the hallway, his voice taking on the tone of someone salvaging a narrative. "Major incident on 3rd floor, we need emergency intubation. And call the nursing supervisor, we have a security situation." But Katie was already standing, stepping back as Webb's breathing began to steady on its own, as his body remembered how to pull oxygen from the air without mechanical assistance. The monitors had stopped screaming. His color had stabilized from purple to the faint flush of someone coming back from the edge. She'd saved him twice now, once from rubble, once from poison dressed up in a trial protocol. "You're done," she said to no one in particular. Not a question. A statement of fact. Security arrived 90 seconds later, two guards she recognized from the day's shift, their faces embarrassed and uncertain because they'd been summoned for a nurse who'd just saved the patient in the bed. Ashford was already spinning his narrative, his phone pressed to his ear, his words coming fast and authoritative: boundary violations, patient endangerment, the woman's unstable. He turned to the security guards. "Remove her. Now." Katie removed her gloves and dropped them in the biohazard disposal. She was no longer allowed to be in this room, so leaving it was a matter of logistics, not consequence. The guards walked her down to the HR office where a woman with a binder and apologetic eyes pushed a termination letter across an aluminum desk at 08 for 3 hours. Security escorted her to her locker. By 0900 hours, Katie Morrison had collected 4 items: her jacket with a faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, her personal scrubs, a pen someone had lent her 6 years ago, and the specific knowledge that Dr. Ashford's phone calls had already been made. The calls had come in a sequence that suggested planning. Hospital board at 0630 hours, a conversation about concerning behavioral patterns and a potential mental health crisis. State licensing board at 0647 hours, complaints about boundary violations and patient endangerment, all documented in the official record he'd created during her week of humiliation. VA Disability Office at 0702 hours, a carefully worded suggestion that Katie's medical discharge might need review if she was exhibiting signs of instability that had been hidden. Each brick part of a wall designed to ensure she would never practice medicine again in any capacity in any state, under any circumstances. By 1100 hours, her access to Oak Creek Memorial had been terminated. By 1300 hours, her patient records clearance had been revoked. By 1600 hours, she was sitting in the laundry room at 2100 hours folding her scrubs one final time under fluorescent lights, the fabric still warm from the industrial dryer, steam rising from the pile like something giving up its ghost. Dr. Ashford watched from his office window 3 stories above, phone pressed to his ear, sealing the last call that would ensure her name stayed in the complaint database long enough to poison any future application, any future reference, any future attempt to exist in medical practice. She tucked the folded scrubs into her bag next to the old jacket. Her fingers brushed the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the only thing she'd kept from Sanjin besides the scars and the muscle memory and the 20-year-old image of a child she'd pulled from rubble. One measured breath. She turned off the light herself. 11 p.m. found Katie Morrison in the laundry room of Oak Creek Memorial, folding her own scrubs for the last time. The fabric was still warm from the industrial dryer, carrying the ghost of antiseptic and her own sweat. Her hands moved through the ritual with the same precision she'd once used to pack a medical bag before deployment, smooth, methodical, muscle memory executing when the mind couldn't bear to think. Scrub top. Scrub pants. Fold. Stack. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in the color of surrender. Through the small window above the folding table, she could see the reflection of Dr. Ashford's office on the 3rd floor, his silhouette motionless at the window, watching her fold the clothes of her exile. Not savoring the victory. Just watching. Like a hunter verifying the wounded animal had finally stopped moving. The security escort had been unnecessary. Katie had walked out of the hospital administrator's office with her personal effects in a cardboard box, her badge already removed from her scrubs. No scene. No anger. Just a nod to the uniformed officer who'd been tasked with the indignity of standing 5 feet away while she gathered her things. The severance letter cited patient boundary violations. The termination was immediate. Her state nursing license would be under review within 10 business days. The box contained her stethoscope, a coffee mug someone had given her in 2003, and her old jacket. The one with the unit patch sewn into the lining. She'd chosen the jacket deliberately, worn it through the hallway knowing Ashford was watching, wanting him to see her walk out wearing it, that small visible flaw that would have made him curious if he'd been looking at her instead of at his own reflection. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence from everyone else. No one had fought for her. No one had questioned the narrative Ashford had spent weeks constructing. The nurses who'd abandoned her in the break room averted their eyes as she walked past. The supervisor who'd signed the termination order had stood 5 feet away, unable to meet her gaze. Webb had still been sedated, his recovery precarious, unable to witness anything. And Katie had folded her scrubs in the laundry room at 11 p.m. because that was when the building was emptiest, when she wouldn't have to perform composure anymore, when the lights could just hum their mechanical song and she could remember who she'd been before she became just another nurse they could erase. She was placing the last folded scrub top into her bag when the fluorescent lights of Oak Creek Memorial suddenly died. Not dimmed. Not flickered. All of them, all at once, plunging the entire building into a darkness so complete it felt like being buried. 3 seconds. That was the duration of the blackout. But in those 3 seconds, Katie's hand stilled, and her mind calculated, power backup should engage in 4.7 seconds. Switchover was automatic. Something was wrong with the switchover. The lights roared back to life, and in that moment of restoration, Katie heard something that stopped her breathing. The sound of rotors. Not one. Multiple. The distinctive beat of UH-60M Black Hawk helicopters, their blades cutting through the night air above Raleigh with the precision of a surgical strike. She moved to the laundry room window and looked down at the parking lot. 3 helicopters were setting down on the grass beyond the perimeter, and soldiers were already moving across the tarmac. Not civilian security. Soldiers. 200 of them, she'd count later. But first, they were just silhouettes in formation, boots striking concrete with the unified rhythm of a strike team deploying into hostile territory. The front entrance of Oak Creek Memorial erupted like a dam had broken. Soldiers in dress uniforms, forest green, medals bright, bearing the insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment and JSOC Task Force units, moved through the doors with the controlled speed of operators executing a planned breach. A Green Beret major, his voice cutting through the lobby with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, called out, "Major Katie Morrison. Bring her to the atrium. Now." It wasn't a request. It was a command structured in the language of military precision. Nurses froze at their stations. Orderlies dropped clipboards. The night charge nurse, a woman named Patricia who'd turned away from Katie in the break room 3 weeks earlier, reached for her phone with trembling fingers, then seemed to remember that calling security on a building full of soldiers was not a tactical option. Katie was still holding her folded scrubs when the laundry room door opened and a ranger captain with the call sign Bear stitched into his uniform looked at her with recognition that came from photographs, from briefings, from the kind of institutional knowledge that only lived in classified files. "Major Morrison," he said, and it was the first time in 14 years that Katie had heard her rank spoken aloud by someone who knew what it meant. "You need to come with us. Now." She didn't ask questions. She placed the folded scrubs into her bag, pulled on her jacket, that old jacket with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, and followed Captain Bear into the corridor. The soldiers parted as she moved through them, and she understood without being told that she was no longer the woman in faded scrubs accepting humiliation. Something in her bearing had shifted. Her shoulders had straightened. Her eyes had hardened. The composure she'd maintained through Ashford's assault suddenly had nowhere to hide. It was written across her face like a map of territory already conquered. The atrium of Oak Creek Memorial had never held this many soldiers. They stood in formation, dress uniforms pristine, eyes fixed forward, patient and waiting like a military unit holding perimeter. At the center of the formation stood Colonel Marcus Webb, despite his purport, despite the clear fluid still running into his arm, despite the medical advice that he absolutely should not be standing. He was in uniform. Full dress uniform. The kind you wore when you wanted the world to understand that what came next was official. Katie stopped at the base of the atrium steps. Webb's voice carried through the space like a benediction, and every soldier in the building heard the words that would end Dr. Ashford's career. "Major Katie Morrison saved my life in Sanjin 20 years ago. I was 8 years old. We were caught in crossfire. She carried me through rubble and fire, and she didn't set me down until I was safe." He paused, and his voice dropped so that the entire atrium had to go silent to hear him. "She saved my life again last week when someone tried to kill me with medication designed to fail. The orders to use those medications came from inside this hospital. From someone trusted. Someone who'd already tried to destroy her reputation before anyone could connect the dots." The hospital administrator arrived at a run, his face the color of old paper, holding Katie's personnel file like it was a sacred document that might suddenly make sense. His hands trembled as he opened it, and his voice shook as he began reading. "Major Katie Morrison. Bronze Star." He paused. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside, hammering against the windows like applause. "Second Bronze Star. Another pause. The administrator's voice cracked. Purple Heart. Combat Medical Badge. Classified Medical Training, Special Forces Medical Course Instructor Certification, 147 combat medics trained under direct fire conditions, 23 years of military medical service prior to medical discharge in 2003. A 3-star general stepped forward, a woman with grey hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to telling hard truths to people who didn't want to hear them. Major Morrison developed trauma protocols used by every Special Operations Command unit in the Middle East. Her techniques for field stabilization under fire are taught at every medical training facility from Bragg to Coronado. Her medical discharge was for injuries sustained protecting 12 soldiers from a vehicle-borne IED. She saved all 12. 2 soldiers remained unresponsive, and despite her best efforts, despite performing open cardiac massage for 18 minutes in a combat zone, they didn't survive. The general's eyes found Katie's. The PTSD diagnosis in her file, which was illegally accessed by Dr. Ashford and weaponized to discredit her allegations, documents survivors' guilt from those 2 soldiers. It does not describe instability. It describes conscience. The room shifted. Katie watched the supervisor's face crumble. The nurses who'd abandoned her in the break room suddenly became very interested in the floor tiles. Captain Bear moved to stand beside Katie, and his position was unambiguous. He was no longer an escort. He was a guard, but for her safety, not her containment. And then the FBI agent arrived, a woman in a charcoal suit carrying a briefcase that contained the architecture of Dr. Ashford's destruction. She opened it on the nearest table and spread the evidence like a hand of cards that couldn't be folded. Pharmaceutical company payments to Dr. Ashford totaling $340,000. Falsified consent forms for experimental drug trials. Altered medical records designed to hide adverse reactions in patients who should never have been enrolled. Webb's file showed unauthorized medication combinations, opioid interactions designed to test efficacy thresholds, with Ashford receiving $15,000 per patient enrollment in trials that veterans had never consented to. 3 other veterans died in the past 18 months, the FBI agent said, and her voice carried the weight of bodies. Identical respiratory presentations to Colonel Webb's crash. Deaths Ashford attributed to service-related complications in reports he filed directly, bypassing standard peer review. His administrative authority allowed him to classify them as expected outcomes. She placed 3 files on the table. 3 photographs of young soldiers who'd made it home alive only to be killed by the system that was supposed to protect them. The hospital's legal counsel arrived with a suspension order from the state medical board. Criminal referral. Immediate termination. Ashford tried to speak, his voice emerged thin and desperate. Katie Morrison was unstable. I was protecting patients. Her allegations were part of a psychotic pattern. The administrator cut him off. His voice was hollow, the sound of someone who'd just realized he'd been complicit in the architecture of his own institution's destruction. You accessed her classified PTSD documentation without authorization. You weaponized her medical discharge against her. You filed complaints with the state board knowing they would trigger a license review investigation, which would generate the exact paper trail that gave the FBI jurisdiction to subpoena your communications. The administrator's hands had stopped trembling. They were shaking with fury instead. Every complaint you filed about Major Morrison gave them another thread to pull. Dr. Ashford's face had gone the color of a man understanding that his carefully constructed strategy had been a game of chess where his opponent had known every move 3 turns in advance. The nurses who'd abandoned Katie couldn't meet anyone's eyes. The supervisor who'd signed her termination letter stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, and Katie recognized the expression. It was the look of someone realizing they'd helped destroy a hero because they hadn't been brave enough to ask questions. Katie's sister, Webb's sister, actually, the 8-year-old's older sibling who'd grown into a military attorney, found Katie in the hallway as soldiers began escorting Dr. Ashford from the building. You knew something was wrong, his sister said. Her voice was steady, but underneath it ran a current of emotion barely contained. You stayed even when he destroyed you. Katie's hand moved to her jacket, to the lining where the faded unit patch was sewn. The fabric was worn soft from 20 years of carrying it. I took an oath, Katie said quietly. The enemy doesn't change that. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It didn't just end careers. It fundamentally altered how every person in that hospital understood the meaning of heroism. Because when Dr. Ashford's hospital ID hit the desk with a plastic clatter as 6 security officers escorted him from the building, the same security team that had walked Katie out just 4 hours earlier, everyone understood that the scales didn't just balance. They'd shifted entirely. 200 soldiers stood at attention. The ceremony of military honor rendered in the presence of an institution that had tried to erase her. But Katie Morrison wasn't watching Dr. Ashford's departure. She was looking at Colonel Webb, still standing in full uniform despite his support and the protests of the medical team, meeting her eyes across the atrium with the gaze of a man recognizing his savior for the second time in his life. If you've ever been silently destroyed by someone in a position of power, if you've ever maintained your composure while watching your reputation crumble, if you ever kept your oath even when nobody was watching, hit like and subscribe. Because heroes walk among us, sometimes pushing mops, sometimes folding scrubs, sometimes wearing rank they've never spoken aloud. And sometimes, when you least expect it, the system works exactly as it should. Thanks for watching.